I put each hero on their own perfect map, and we're going to see how far they can get. We started with Quincy and got him to max level on round 50. Here, he was popping everything right as they got in range, and his abilities made it even faster. It wasn't until the ceramic rushes on round 55 that something made it past him, but he cleaned them up before the Bloons finished a single lap. So, they didn't even make it 5% of the way to the exit. The nice thing about this map, other than the length, is that the Bloons overlap each other no matter what lap or direction they're going. This way, we can get the most out of Quincy's Pierce and abilities with each attack. This let him take on rounds that are usually way too hard for him, like round 95. Here, he was able to keep up with the DDTs until Rapid Shot wore off, but even without his abilities, he popped them pretty quick once they were stacked on top of each other. Normally, he struggles with DDTs, but because of the map and the MIB, he was able to pop them with plenty of track left to spare. Fast forward to the early hundreds, and he was still doing fine, popping the normal ZOMG layers on 111 in just 2 laps and the fortified ones shortly after. This makes sense as Quincy gets plenty of bonus damage to blimps, shoots 3 arrows at a time, and attacks 5 times per second. Not to mention that his rapid shot 4x's his attack speed and how effective Storm of Arrows is at nuking Moabs. The only unfortunate thing about him is how slowly he cleans up these super ceramics inside. It doesn't take that long, but it is scary with how fast they move this late into the game. What's nice though, is how fast he pops bads. On round 119, he popped the outer layer of the first 2 in just 3 laps, giving him more than enough time to clean up the insides. In fact, he did this and still had over half the track left to work with. But Bloons get faster and stronger with each round, so the endless march of blimps got farther and farther until they leaked. And for Quincy, it was round 138 that did him in, with its 126 DDTs. He could take out small packs of DDTs before this, but when the screen was jam-packed with them, he didn't have the Pierce to damage them all in time. So, round 138 is Quincy's limit. Next up, we have Gwen. She makes sense to put on the straight line map as her attacks don't seek, and we want the Bloons to pass over her walls of fire as much as possible. We got her to level 20 in the 50s and watched her melt everything. Nothing could stand up to her flamethrower. Even in the 90s, things were popping fast. Her main attack was doing way more than I expected, ZOMGs were broken down in a lap or 2, BFBs and Moabs melted quickly, DDTs weren't an issue, and when the screen was full of Bloons, Gwen didn't flinch. Her 2 abilities are amazing at taking out huge hordes of Bloons, so this wasn't a problem. And before we knew it, Gwen was facing the bad. This was by far the slowest she'd popped a Bloon all day, as it took almost 4 laps for Gwen to pop the outer layer. As usual, the insides were cleaned up pretty quick, but now we know that bads are Gwen's weakness. The early hundreds that follow are full of odd combinations of huge rushes of balloons and weird amounts of blimps. I feel like the game just throws each type at you and hopes you're weak to one of them. My favorite of which is 104, where you face hundreds of leads, ceramics, purples, and Moabs with 39 BFBs layered on top. This round ends basically any run that's slow on Pierce, but like we said earlier, that's not Gwen, so she beat this round pretty quick. In fact, she kind of cruised to 119 where some bads challenged her to a rematch. Faster, stronger, and in a group of 3, the purple whales swam through the track. They made it about twice as far as the round 100 one as they got to laps 7, 8, and 9 before the purple layers were popped. And the insides made it a couple laps farther, almost getting to the halfway point on this long map. But Gwen continued on, taking on tough rounds like 135. How she's still able to pop fortified DDTs in time and can crack down on fortified ZOMGs in the same round is wild, but at this point, the Bloons were getting pretty far. Round 138 scared me a bit as the map was full of DDTs for quite some time, but as fast as they came, they disappeared. But then it was time for the fortified bad, and Gwen just didn't have the damage. She was not on pace to pop this tanky Bloon, but what actually leaked first was a DDT inside the normal bad behind it. So Gwen is in first with a score of 140. Next up, we have Sai, the Psychic Child. They were a bit harder to get to level 20, but we got there on round 59. Here, Sai was deleting everything as they entered the screen. I knew Sai's DPS got pretty crazy once they can one-shot ZOMGs, but I forgot how well they can keep up with dense packs of Bloons. This pattern continued until the late 80s, where enough blimps were finally sent that they'd make it a lap or 2 in. The nice thing about Sai though is that their level 20 Scream wipes the screen anytime it's used. Plus, we gotta put Sai in the middle of a skinny oval, meaning their stun can affect an obnoxious amount of Bloons once they start getting far. This started to be useful in the 90s, where it bought some time for Psionic Scream to come off cooldown, like on round 95 where the stun slowed the DDTs long enough for Scream to come back. And since no bad spawn yet, we knew Sai would one-shot every round. But it was only a matter of time until we made it to round 100 and the bad swam through the map completely unfazed. While Sai put on an absolute show from round 60 through 99, This is the earliest loss of the day. Moving on, we have Geraldo, and unlike the other heroes, the early rounds do matter because we can place turrets during this time. So, while I farmed the money to level him up, we placed a turret down anytime he was close to maxing out his stock on them. While not as good as the upgraded turrets, these will be nice to put spicy potions on in the future as we can pickle them without any downside. The first thing I rushed was getting Jerry to level 13 for his upgraded turrets, as they'll be most of his damage later on. Once we unlocked these though, we didn't need to rush anything else. We just placed a turret down anytime they came in stock. I made sure to place them in the middle of the screen as close to the track as possible. This is where they'll perform best and is why I chose this map. The track forces the balloons to overlap with each other no matter what direction they're going, meaning the turrets will get more out of their peers compared to other maps. After we had some upgraded turrets down, we started buying his pet rabbits, the fourth of which we purchased on round 45. This is a super early bunny and it'll easily give us more than enough damage to go back to farming. Here, we got more money than we need for the rest of the game, sold our farms, and focused on Geraldo. I kept placing his turrets and we got ready for his level 20 restock. This happened on round 77 where we got to place 4 more turrets down. But now our plan was simple. Line the map with turrets whenever they're up and keep a camo potion on Geraldo at all times. This way everything gets a range boost and extra damage to camo balloons. And this let us coast through the rest of the normal game and even pop all of round 100 in just over 2 laps. I thought this round and the early hundreds might be tough, but no other items were needed. The turrets and bunny had enough damage and pierce to take out both the bad and the hyper dense rounds that follow. In fact, the next time I used an item was round 119 where I placed down a genie. Geraldo could have beaten this round as is, but there's no real reason not to speed things up, especially since he hadn't struggled yet. And if you're wondering why I'm not placing his nails at the back of the track, BFBs and Larcher are able to hit them when making the turn in the bottom right, so we can't build a wall back there. That being said, I don't think it's worth playing on a shorter map with Rune for these, as when we leak, it'll likely be a huge number of balloons that get through, much too big for a wall of these mines. Anyway, Geraldo plowed through the rounds. Even 137 didn't stand a chance against him and his army of turrets. And it helps that the bunny's damage scales with RBE on screen, similar to the Avatar of Wrath. With this setup, we didn't need glues, traps, or genies to make it to the fortified bad. For this round though, I did slap down 2 genies. It was a bit overkill, but we managed to pop the outer layer just 4 laps in and cleaned up the inside shortly after. Things were looking good. We could handle huge groups of balloons, our single target damage wasn't bad, and we had plenty of items in the shop to bail us out. But we needed this help sooner than I thought we would. Round 146 had an absurd number of BFBs and DDTs, some of which made it to the exit. So we bought a continue and tried again. This time with a genie, some fire spirits, pickles, sharpening stones, and blade traps. And still, some DDTs made it super far. It's tough to take them out when they're layered on top of BFBs, but with all these items, we made it through. The leftovers let us crush 147, but once the genie wore off, things got a bit scarier. We still had the spicy potions and pickles, but some of the DDTs were getting far on 148. To help with this, we put down 2 creepy idols to slow their progress. These idols have a chance to push back balloons and stun blimps every time they pass through their range, and because this map loops back and forth so much, the idols are very effective. These lasted until around 150, where I tried to get by without them. I was hoping we'd get an easy round or just match up better against what sent our way, but that was not the case and several DDTs got through, causing us to try again. We used 2 more totems and placed another spicy potion. This was just enough to pop the DDTs before leaking and let Geraldo focus on the 3 bads sent this round for quite some time. I don't know exactly how far everything got, but I know it was close. But from here on out, we were just scraping by. The creepy idols kept us safe for a bit, but once they expired on 152, we were in trouble. Anytime a turret, spicy potion, or jar of pickles came in stock, we bought them, and we watched his shop for anything else that could help. We rotated through every option, but eventually it wasn't enough. And for Geraldo, it was around 157. Even with us using his entire shop, including a genie, the balloons managed to get through. But he did manage to pass Gwen for first place. Next up, we have Etienne. We put him on the straight line map so that his dragons could max out their pierce more often, and the UCAV would get more out of its explosions once the balloons started overlapping with each other. This is down the road a bit though, as we got him to level 20 in the 50s, and his permanent UCAV kept the balloons at the entrance, leaving very little for our dragons to do except aimlessly fly around Etienne and the MIB. This didn't last forever though. In the 60s, balloons actually started making it to Etienne, so his 8 friends could help out. While included, we We didn't really feel their impact until the early hundreds, where there were enough Bloons to start completing laps around the track, and they were dense enough to max out the pierce of every attack. While scary that there are more Bloons on screen than we can damage, it's nice to know that we're basically maxing out Etienne's DPS for just about every round. Something I was surprised to see was how well Etienne was at dealing with tanky Bloons like fortified ZOMGs. He isn't known for his damage, yet on round 116 he cracked their outer layers super fast once he started focusing them. And this held true for bads as well. On round 119, Etienne popped the outer layer of the first bad in just over 4 laps and dealt decent damage to the other 2 in the process. Overall, the round made it about halfway through the map, but was still much better than I was expecting. I suppose the insanely long map helps a ton when his UCAV is global and the dragons can see most of the track. With this round getting over halfway through though, I was scared of the fortified bad on 140. I thought we were going to get there as he even handled the tanky ZOMGs on 137 just fine, but then his true weakness showed itself. DDTs. Round 138 flooded the screen with these fast blimps, and some got through before even showing signs of thinning out, so Etienne wasn't even close. Still, a score of 138 ties him with Quincy for 3rd overall so far. On to Benjamin, one of the best heroes in the game. I got him down on round 41, used his abilities, and watched him Trojan tons of Bloons. But even with all this effort, every Bloon leaked and caused him to lose, putting him firmly in last place. To be fair, I didn't give him a MIB, so who knows how far he would have gotten. Next, we have Adora. She's an interesting one because we need to farm way more than other heroes if we're going to keep her sacrifices up constantly. So we focused way more on making money in the early game and we'll be keeping some farms the entire run. Fortunately, it was super easy to level her up to 20 with her sacrifice ability, so we got there in the early 50s. Here, her main attack could solo the rounds, but we were using her level 10 ability to speed things up from time to time. The nice thing about this map is her Ball of Light is almost guaranteed to use all of its pierce in the later rounds, and Adora has enough range to see the entire track when her abilities are active. This, combined with her solid popping power, let her cruise through the early hundreds without me even using blood sacrifice. Things were starting to make it a few laps in, but even the fortified ZOMGs on 108 weren't a threat to leaking. The only reason I started sacrificing on around 114 was because I didn't want to lose out of nowhere. But my game plan was simple: place a few more farms and sacrifice them whenever Adora's buff wears off. Were the farms I picked up a bit overkill? Yes. But they were easy to make and we had $1.7 million saved up. But this brought us to round 119 and the 3 bads. I thought single target damage would be her weakness, but with such a long map, she was able to break them down in just a few laps. And after, she got to go back to her bread and butter of destroying waves jam-packed with Bloons. No round was an issue for her. I mean, the 120s and early 30s were a joke. Round 138 though, that was a different story. The map quickly filled with DDTs and stayed for a long time. We slowed down the round to make sure we kept her blood sacrifice buff active, and eventually Adora popped them all. I don't know how far they got, but they had to be close to leaking. And this is where we could tell the Bloons were getting tanky. The Moabs on 139 lasted way longer than I thought they would. I know there are 253 of them, but still, I was starting to worry they'd leak. But then the fortified bad came on round 140. I didn't have high hopes, but I made sure to keep her sacrifice buff up. And to my surprise, she popped that outer layer in 6.5 laps. The insides made it about halfway through the map, but that's way better than I was expecting. And the normal bad wasn't hard to pop after. The only thing was how many sacrifices I had to do while Adora was popping these purple whales. While not an issue for me, it did cost a ton of money. And over the next few rounds, we started bleeding cash. Each wave would end with a bad or two, taking many sacrifices to deal with. So we switched over to eating a slightly cheaper farm while keeping some central markets around for extra cash. We were still losing money, but I couldn't complain because of how well Adora was doing. DDTs were usually popped pretty quick, and she had the pierce to deal with large rushes of ZOMGs and BFBs, or so I thought. This whole run, I assumed a bad would take us out, but on round 149, it was something different. The screen filled with DDTs layered on top of ZOMGs, BFBs, and Moabs. Adora popped a few of them before they got out, but she just didn't have the pierce to damage them all in time. But still, a score of 149 is pretty good. Next, we have Sauda. I knew the straight map would be great for her main attack and sword leap, but I didn't know how good it would be for her level 10 ability. I used sword charge for the first time on round 42, and she ran back and forth along this map so many times, one-shotting the Bloons in the process. The only thing that would have made it better is if she could use her level 3 ability during it. But this destroyed the rounds as her sword charge can re-hit Bloons if the track overlaps, and that's kind of the whole point of this map. We would sometimes run into funny situations where a Bloons hitbox was too small and would go a couple laps before getting hit by Sauda, like on rounds 61 and 62. This worries me a bit for the future rounds when ceramics get faster, but in free play, blimps are our biggest threat and their hitbox is much bigger to where this won't be a problem. And we know she's not maxing out her abilities pierce because that ends sword charge instantly, but this made for an odd experience. Instead of watching our hero attack the balloons like normal, Sauda just ran back and forth the entire time, kind of like she was a balloon. She had to be a balloon to beat the balloons. Fortunately, this essentially turned her into a global hero, not limited to her tiny attack range like normal, and this let her crush the rounds. 104, the round that ended so many of our tier 5 runs, popped like it was nothing. I mean, it took Sauda under 30 seconds to beat rounds 104 through 107. I do have the faster forward mod on, but still, that's so much faster than the other heroes. Nothing was a problem, and before I knew it, we were on round 140. I made sure to spam Sword Leap between charges for that extra 540 damage, and watched her whittle these two bads down. What's nice is no matter what's on screen, she damages everything with her charges. So even if we're against layered balloons or a bad isn't in first, she should be fine. We saw this as she popped the normal bad well before the fortified one, even though it comes out second. But she beat this round with the balloons only getting about halfway through the map. But now, the round started to take a while. Sauda would handle the layered balloons even if it was DDTs hidden behind bigger blimps, and then spend a while popping a bad or two. This wasn't a problem until round 160, where the whales were just too fast and tanky. They made it most of the way through the map, and the layers beneath took too long to pop. But the worst part was the ceramics leaked because of a sword charge missing on the last couple laps. But even with a sword leap, a few made it to the exit. But this put Sauda on first with a score of 160. On to Brickell. I put her in the middle of a skinny oval since her pistol does single target damage and her Megamind explosions are big enough to damage everything. Plus, this makes her mini sea mines able to always be useful. We got her to level 20 in the mid 50s and the balloons didn't stand a chance. Her pistol was one-shotting everything, the sea mines were dealing 22 damage each, and her Megamind was popping the mobs even though it was completely unnecessary. Surprisingly though, this fell off pretty quick. In the 80s, Brickell's Megamind and pistol would pop the blimp players fast, especially if naval tactics was active, but the swarms of super ceramics were tough for her to deal with. They now take more than one shot to pop, especially when fortified, so they would get kinda far when there's a bunch of them, like on round 84. The nice thing was her Megamind and naval tactics could catch her up quick if needed. But in the 90s, the rounds just got bigger and bigger. Eventually, they got to the point where Megamind stopped bailing her out as it only has 150 pierce. It would still pop a ton of blimps with each explosion, but the ceramics would run amok for several laps. We got a short break from this on round 100 as we popped the bad's outer layer only a quarter of a lap in, but the early hundreds went right back to overwhelming her. And on round 103, the balloons got through. Brickell did manage to break all the ZOMGs down to ceramics, but couldn't clean them all up in time, so she did just barely better than Sai. Shifting gears, we have Ezili, who we maxed out on around 57. Instantly, she was one-shotting the balloons, but not in the traditional way. No, it was one attack, and her damage over time ticks would bring them down to nothing. It was actually pretty satisfying to watch, similar to a balloon solver. One thing we had to do though was keep a few central markets down bottom to build up some lives. You see, we were spamming her sacrificial totem to give Ezili more range, pierce, and attack speed, and this eats 1 life per use, which can add up once the rounds get long. Outside of this, Ezili had a few nice perks. We didn't have to worry about regrows because of her grow blocker, and blimps were a non-factor because of her Moab Hex one-shotting them and her main attack dealing tons of damage to Moab class balloons. This let her easily coast to the hundreds where she had to take on some huge swarms. The hardest part for her was when there were tons of Moabs as her Hex couldn't pop them all, and super ceramics would come pouring out. She would pop them with plenty of track left, but ZOMGs and bads were much easier for her as she can skip the insides, like on round 119 where she used 3 hexes to pop the bads before they finished a single lap. But as the rounds went on, the balloons got farther and farther, especially if the round was full of DDTs or weaker blimps like BFBs and Moabs, as Hex can only jump to so many blimps before ending. A good showing of this was round 133, where some of the ceramics inside the BFBs got so far before being popped, but the ZOMGs afterwards were super easy to deal with. But as you might have guessed, it was the crazy number of DDTs on round 138 that did her in. She got a 4 hexes before leaking, and they were starting to thin out, but a few DDTs made it out in time. So 138 is her score. Moving on, we have Churchill, and this guy's damage is so high that we're going to skip straight to the hundreds, where even here he was making the game look easy. Round 105 only made it 1 lap in before it was over, and the following laps didn't do much better. This makes sense, as each shell Churchill shoots can explode up to 7 times, and each explosion has 20 pierce and 20 damage. not to mention his machine gun and abilities that bring his DPS even higher. He kept on dumpstering the rounds like it was his day job, which I guess it is, but still, he even did fine against the 126 DDTs on round 138. It was basically impossible to count how far they got, but based on the time it took him to pop the round, the DDTs were roughly 16 laps in, so about 2/3 of the way through the track. The round after this was much easier for him, but we could see Churchill getting pierce capped by the Moabs as his shells weren't shooting through to the other side. This is nice in that we're maxing out his DPS, but scary that he's hitting his limit. But now we have to take on the fortified bad. Usually, a max level Churchill is amazing at taking out bads because his Moab barrage does 8,000 damage to them per use, but this fortified guy comes in at 200,000 health, much more than we'd see in a normal game of chimps. But even with this crazy HP, Churchill popped the outer layer in just 6 laps and handled the insides before they made it halfway through the map. The rest of the 140s weren't too bad. The rounds would normally start off with Churchill breaking all the DDTs and Moabs, then whittling down the massive numbers of fortified ZOMGs. And by the time those were taken care of, Moab Barrage would break the bads open, leaving just some simple cleanup. The only annoying thing was Churchill must have a memory leak or something because my game was running so much slower than any other hero. But if I exited to home and loaded back in, it'd be better for a couple rounds. Honestly, not a big deal, just an odd bug. But this balloon popping pattern continued for the rest of the game. Round 172 opened with a bunch of DDTs that he popped first, followed closely by a massive rush of BFBs. And while we were handling the last of them, Moab Barrage busted open the ZOMGs for Churchill to pop next. And once he cleared them up, Churchill focused on the bads until they were no more. I didn't know when this was going to end, as he even popped the fortified DDTs on 173 right away, but surprisingly, the rest of the round was too much. He just didn't have the pierce to keep up with all the blimps sent his way. But still, a score of 173 easily puts him in first place. On to Rosalia. I had no idea what to expect. I just knew we needed a long map for her to fly around on and set it up so her lasers would shoot straight down the track. I do wish more heroes performed better on other maps, but it makes sense why the straight line is so good for most of them. Anyway, we got her to level 20 in the 60s, and she was just spawn camping the balloons with her jetpack ability, and she had a kinetic charge ready and waiting for blimps to spawn. It really wasn't fair until the 90s, where her pierce started to be an issue. On round 98, her laser broke down the first few blimps, but couldn't damage much more than that. She did this fast, as each laser deals 60 damage to Moab class balloons, but only has 10 pierce. Because of this, she was pretty reliant on her abilities to damage larger groups of balloons. Luckily, kinetic charge and scatter missile were both killing it on this map because of how grouped up everything got. Round 111 showed this perfectly. Her main attack could break open ZOMGs and BFBs, but kinetic charge was hard carrying. Every time she used it, the explosion did a minimum 4,000 damage to every balloon nearby. The only thing that would have made it better is if we could charge it up more effectively. But this helped us keep up with the rounds, and Scatter Missile and her main attack could clean up the fast, weaker balloons leading the charge. In the moment, I didn't realize how much kinetic charge was doing, so I was worried about the 3 bads on 119. But she said,
"You can't run from me."
Hunted each one of them down, popping one every couple laps. If she could have popped them all at once, it would have been a masterclass, but I can't complain with how well she did. Rosalia's level 10 ability carried her until she hit a round it couldn't deal with. And just like many other heroes, it was 138. The DDTs quickly filled the map, only letting her get 2 kinetic charges off this round. And while her main attacks did pop quite a few of them, some DDTs managed to get through in the end. But with this, she tied Ezili, Quincy, and Etienne with a score of 138. Next, we have Pat Fusty. He hit level 20 in the 50s, and not much made it past him. He was either one-shotting the balloons or pushing Moabs back towards the entrance until they broke down to ceramics. This continued for a while, but once BFBs and ZOMG started coming, they got past him. He can only slow these guys down, not push them back like he can to smaller balloons. It was fun to watch rounds like 86 though, where he would stall the Moabs in one place once he broke through that tougher BFB layer. He wasn't the fastest at breaking through these though. This makes sense as he's more of a support hero in that he buys your monkeys time and gives them extra damage with his roar, but we could really feel this lack of popping power in the 90s. Round 95 filled the screen with DDTs and Moabs long enough that I was scared they were going to leak. And round 96 just walked right past Pat until he popped them down to the pufferfish level. This only took a couple laps with the BFBs, but the ZOMGs took a while. So clearly the tough balloons are his biggest problem. Literally. This didn't give me the most hope for round 100, but by constantly roaring, he was able to pop the outer layer just over halfway through the map and pick off the children before they leap. Now, I could have hugged the ZOMGs, but I'm going to be honest. I forgot he can hug more than one at a time at level 20, and I didn't want to offset them and maybe have some ceramic sprint for the exit while telling him to hug the second one. Knowing this would have been helpful for the early hundreds, like 103 where the round ends with 10 fortified ZOMGs. Hugging them to BFBs definitely would have been the play. Oh well, he managed to get by anyway. It was just harder and took longer. What did beat him though was round 106 with its 93 DDTs, over 3 times as many as what came on round 95, and 27 of them were fortified. But with this score, he was able to beat Brickell and Sai by a few rounds. Next, we have the hardest hero to do this with, Corvus. We got him to max level in the 50s and his spirit was one-shotting everything to the point where I didn't need to cast any spells. I forgot how strong his base spirit gets at the end, probably because I'm usually so focused on using spells that I don't think about it. But I didn't really start clicking buttons until round 96 where I toggled on aggression and had to use Soul Harvest and Dark Ritual to keep up his mana pool. This was pretty easy to do until round 100 where there was only one Bloon to siphon mana from. The bad. Luckily, it only made it 2.5 laps in before popping. Even at this point though, the run had lasted long enough that Soul Harvest got disabled, so it would have been very difficult to keep his mana up for much longer. But with this, we were in the early hundreds, and luckily for us, the more Bloons there are on screen, the easier it is to get mana for Corvus. So I just spam spells like Aggression, Echo, Ember, Frostbound Spear, and Storm, and whenever he'd get low, I'd Dark Ritual the Horde and instantly cap him out. There was no real rhyme or reason to it. I just went in with the thought that the more spells the better, and all of them work super well on a map like this where the Bloons overlap with each other constantly. We managed to beat all sorts of rounds, those with tons of DDTs, some with just a few fortified ZOMGs, and everything in between. But on round 111, I figured it was time to start breaking out the big guns, Ancestral Might. I used one Echo Might combo and saw the potential. In just one use, it broke down several ZOMGs, which was perfect because these faster BFBs separated from the pack, making them easier to see and deal with. And once we had enough mana, I used Echo Trample to clean up the front of the track. This is similar to Sauda in that the spirit runs back and forth over the Bloons, dealing tons and tons of damage. With this and a few more spells, we were able to beat the round. I kept spamming spells and trying out new combos on future rounds, and I started to get scared. I couldn't tell if some were slightly better than others, and what if I just barely lose when a win is possible? Oh well, if a skill issue does happen, I'll just have to hope that some of you guys can beat my score. Anyway, our experimenting brought us to round 119. We started off strong with Storm and Aggression, but we quickly ran out of mana. I used Corvus's abilities whenever they were in range, but once Soul Harvest got disabled, it was kind of over. I even Spirit Walked Corvus around to get more out of Dark Ritual, but he wasn't able to get everything. The DDTs inside the final bad got through. But a score of 119 puts him in the middle of the pack. For our second to last hero, we have Striker Jones. This guy revolves around explosions, so we had to put him on a map with the most overlap. Here, his attacks were alright, but what was impressive was his concussive shell. We were spamming that in the 50s, and whatever it hit basically couldn't move. Even the BFB on 60 was inching through the map, and this was on 10 times speed instead of the normal 3 times. Soon though, we could tell that damage would be his problem, not pierce or attack speed or something else like that. The moment Super Ceramic started coming, around 82, we got a glimpse into the future. Striker was able to stun the BFBs until they were just Moabs, and then they'd start to haul through the map. If they weren't being stunned, Super Ceramics could make it an extra lap or two. The nice thing though was he could pop them and damage blimps farther back because of the explosion's pierce. So even when he focused Ceramics, Striker was not neglecting the Moab class Bloons. This only got worse as time went on though, like on 98 where the round started off great, but once some BFBs broke down, the Moabs and Ceramics ran free. We were never really afraid of leaking, but that's not a good sign if he's shooting for first place on this list. Then the bad came and made it 13 laps around before Striker broke its outer layer. Luckily, there are few enough Bloons inside that he could stun just about everything until popped and move on to the early hundreds. And these were interesting. There were enough Bloons on screen that I couldn't track how far everything was getting, especially when mixing in that some of them were getting stunned. But he kept getting through. He even managed to pop the layered DDTs and BFBs on round 110. It wasn't pretty, and it took a very long time, but he got through. And this was the theme of the run, just brute force stuns. Nothing fancy, nothing special, and it worked until round 115 where the fortified DDTs were too much. I don't think it even had to do with them being layered, they were just too fast and tanky for Striker to handle. So he did slightly worse than Corvus. And finally, we have Obyn, my second most used hero only after Benjamin. We got him to level 20 on 49 and he was keeping the Bloons at bay. Ceramics and weaker he could handle, while Moabs would make it to his brambles or wall of trees. But because we were constantly using these abilities, nothing made it past him for a while. In fact, it wasn't really until the 80s that Bloons started completing laps. Here, the ZOMGs were too big for his wall of trees, and brambles only do 500 damage a pierce, so it wasn't crazy to expect the 2 ZOMGs on 85 to get past. But his main attack was able to break these outer layers, and the trees ate up all the BFBs inside. After just a few of these lobsters though, it would be full and take a while for another wall to get placed down. This really showed itself on 96, where the map would be full of blimps, and where a different hero's level 10 ability would bail them out of this situation, the trees would pop a few BFBs and burst into bananas. Not the most ideal for this challenge. Still though, he was getting by. He even managed to pop the bad's outer layer in just 6.5 laps. How? Well, brambles actually did a ton of work here as we were spamming them the entire round, and every time the bad went by, it'd have to pass over 1 or 2 of them. But we all knew this wouldn't last forever. Obyn isn't known for his damage, he's known for boosting other magic monkeys like druids, and without them, he's pretty weak. It was round 104 with its hundreds of Bloons and blimps that got through, and honestly, it wasn't even close. But that was how far every hero can get on their perfect map in BTD6. Churchill got first with 173, Sauda got second with 160, and Geraldo finished in third with 157. If you want to see me do this with every monkey, click this video right here.